A house full of silence and secrets, not the kind that whisper in the night, but the ones buried beneath polished floors and gleaming chandeliers. She had given her heart to children who weren't hers. Now they would forget her name forever. I don't know where you're listening from. Maybe you're caring for a child that isn't yours, setting a dinner table, or waiting for someone to say thank you. It doesn't matter what time it is, but I promise, today's story will touch your heart. The October wind swept across Chicago's Gold Coast, carrying with it the scent of autumn leaves and the distant hum of Lake Michigan. Inside the towering Mansell mansion, where every marble step cost more than most people's yearly salaries, Evelyn Martinez moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to make herself invisible while remaining indispensable. Her worn hands, scarred from years of service, folded tiny pajamas with the same tenderness she once used to dress her own daughter. A child she had lost to circumstances beyond her control, a wound that had never fully healed, but had taught her to love other people's children as if they were pieces of her broken heart made whole again. The mansion stood like a monument to wealth and emotional distance, its 37 rooms echoing with the hollow sound of success without substance. James Mansell's net worth exceeded $200 million, built from a tech empire that had revolutionized cloud computing. His investment portfolio included everything from blue-chip stocks to cryptocurrency holdings worth millions in Bitcoin alone. Yet for all his financial assets and capital gains, the man couldn't buy what Evelyn gave freely every day: unconditional love to his children, Lily and Noah. Evelyn had arrived 6 months after James's bitter divorce from his second wife, when the house still reeked of lawyers' fees and custody battles that had cost him nearly $30 million in settlements. The children, 7-year-old Lily with her mother's green eyes and 10-year-old Noah with his father's stubborn chin, had been caught in the crossfire of adult ambitions and broken promises. When Evelyn first walked through those imposing oak doors, carrying her single suitcase and a heart full of hope, she found 2 children who had forgotten how to trust that someone might stay. The new stepmother, Vivian, had entered their lives like a perfectly polished investment, beautiful, calculated, and ultimately hollow. She wore designer clothes that cost more than Evelyn's monthly salary, and spoke of the children as if they were portfolio additions rather than human beings who needed bedtime stories and scraped-knee comfort. Vivian's own trust fund, inherited from old Chicago Railroad money, gave her the confidence to treat the household staff as invisible fixtures, useful but unworthy of genuine acknowledgement. But Evelyn saw beyond the marble and mahogany. She heard Noah's silent tears when he thought no one was listening, noticed how Lily flinched whenever adults raised their voices, recognized the hunger in their eyes, not for food, which was always abundant, but for someone to truly see them. In the pre-dawn hours, when the city was still wrapped in darkness and the mansion's smart home system dimmed its automated lights, Evelyn would pad softly to their rooms, adjusting covers, checking on fever dreams, being present in the way that money could never purchase. Her own small room on the 3rd floor, tucked between guest quarters and storage spaces, became a sanctuary of warmth in the cold vastness. She had decorated it with photographs of her late mother, a worn Bible, and a single stuffed elephant, faded blue and missing one ear, that had once belonged to the daughter she'd given up for adoption 23 years ago. Sometimes, late at night, she would hold that elephant and whisper prayers for the child she'd never see grow up, finding solace in caring for Lily and Noah with the fierce protectiveness she'd never been able to give her own flesh and blood. The daily rhythm of the Mansell household revolved around schedules that maximized efficiency and minimized emotional connection. James left for his downtown office before the children woke, his driver navigating the Tesla through morning traffic while he reviewed quarterly profit reports and cryptocurrency market fluctuations. His days were measured in conference calls worth millions, merger discussions that could triple his company's valuation, and investor meetings where billions of dollars in venture capital hung in the balance. He returned after dinner most nights, kissing his children's foreheads with the same distracted affection he might show prized possessions, valuable but ultimately functional. Evelyn filled the spaces his absence created. She was there when Noah struggled with multiplication tables, sitting beside him at the kitchen island with infinite patience, turning math into stories about pirates dividing treasure. She was there when Lily woke from nightmares about her birth mother leaving, singing soft lullabies in Spanish, songs her own mother had sung to her in their tiny apartment back when love was all they could afford. She was there for skinned knees and hurt feelings, for first loose teeth and school plays, for all the small moments that accumulate into childhood memories. Yet, her love existed in the margins. She ate her meals alone in the kitchen after serving the family in the formal dining room. She watched from doorways during birthday parties, ensuring everything ran smoothly while never being invited to join the celebration. She heard James tell business associates, "Oh, that's just Evelyn, the nanny," in the same tone he might use to mention the security system or the landscaping service. Functional, necessary, but certainly not family. The phrase cut deeper each time, a paper cut to the soul that never quite healed because it was administered so casually, so regularly. Vivian's treatment was even more pointed. She would dismiss Evelyn from conversations when other wealthy mothers visited, as if the nanny's presence somehow diminished the social atmosphere. She criticized everything from Evelyn's choice of children's clothes, too colorful, not sophisticated enough for the Mansell image, to her cooking, too ethnic. The children need more refined palates. She instituted rules that felt designed to remind Evelyn of her place. No sitting in the main living areas when not working, no answering the front door when guests arrived, no joining family photos even when the children begged for her inclusion. But children have a way of seeing truth that adults learn to ignore. Noah began asking why Evelyn couldn't eat dinner with them. Lily started introducing her to school friends as "my Evelyn" with possessive pride. They gravitated toward her warmth the way flowers turn toward sunlight, instinctively recognizing the genuine love that surrounded them in her presence. Their drawings, proudly displayed on the refrigerator, often featured stick figure families that included a woman with kind eyes and outstretched arms labeled Evelyn right alongside Daddy and Vivian. The first crack in James's emotional armor came on a rainy Tuesday in November when the city was draped in gray and the mansion felt more like a mausoleum than a home. Lily had been fighting a persistent cough for days. Nothing serious, the family physician assured them, just a seasonal bug that would pass. But fevers in young children have a way of spiking without warning, and that night Lily's temperature soared to dangerous levels while the adults slept soundly in their distant bedrooms. It was Evelyn who heard the child's delirious crying, who felt the burning heat of fever through thin pajamas, who made the split-second decision to rush Lily to Children's Memorial Hospital through empty streets slicked with November rain. She held the little girl in the back of a taxi, whispering prayers and promises, watching the city lights blur past the windows like fallen stars. In the emergency room, she became both mother and advocate, answering medical questions with detailed knowledge of Lily's health history, signing consent forms with the authority that love, not law, had granted her. James received the call at 3 a.m, his sleep fractured by the ringtone that meant business emergencies. Instead, he heard Evelyn's calm voice explaining that his daughter was stable but hospitalized, that the fever had broken, that she had never left Lily's side. The relief in her voice was unmistakable, not the professional concern of an employee, but the deep gratitude of someone who loved that child, as if she had carried her in her own womb. By the time James arrived at the hospital, disheveled and panicked, he found Evelyn asleep in a chair beside Lily's bed, her hand resting protectively on the child's arm, her face peaceful despite the fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell that marked the vigil she had kept alone. That image, Evelyn watching over his daughter with the fierce tenderness of maternal love, remained burned in James's consciousness long after they returned home. He began to notice things he had previously overlooked, How Lily ran to Evelyn for comfort before anyone else. How Noah saved his best jokes and proudest discoveries to share with her first. How the house felt different when she was there. Warmer, more alive, more like an actual home than a showcase of wealth and status. He found himself pausing in doorways to watch her read bedtime stories, her voice painting pictures more vivid than any of the mansion's expensive artwork. He noticed how she never asked for anything. No raises, no time off, no recognition, yet gave everything of herself with a generosity that shamed his own emotional stinginess. The children adored her with the uncomplicated devotion that only the young can offer. They sought her approval, craved her attention, and unconsciously modeled themselves after her kindness. Noah started helping elderly neighbors carry groceries without being asked, emulating Evelyn's quiet service to others. Lily began sharing her toys with less fortunate children at school, channeling the generosity she witnessed daily. They were becoming better people because of her influence, developing empathy and compassion that their enormous trust funds and private school education could never provide. But Vivian saw Evelyn's growing influence as a threat to her own tenuous position in the family. The children's obvious preference for the nanny over their stepmother created a rivalry that festered beneath the surface of polite household routines. Vivian's own insecurities about her role, her worth, her hold on James's affections transformed Evelyn from a mere employee into a perceived enemy. She began documenting every minor mistake, cataloging complaints, and building a case for the nanny's dismissal with the methodical precision of someone who felt her own position slipping away. The confrontation that would shatter everything began with a bottle of pills. Vivian had been struggling with anxiety and depression for months, conditions that her privileged upbringing had taught her to view as personal failures rather than treatable medical issues. She had been secretly taking prescription medication, hiding her struggles behind a facade of perfection that her social circle demanded. The pills, Xanax for panic attacks, Ambien for sleepless nights haunted by her own inadequacies, were kept in her purse, alongside the credit cards and cash that symbolized her worth in the only terms she understood. But addiction has a way of making even wealthy people desperate. When Vivian's prescription ran out and her doctor suggested therapy instead of increased medication, she began hoarding pills, acquiring them through means that would have horrified the society matrons who lunched at her table. She stashed extras in various hiding places throughout the mansion, including a small bottle forgotten in a guest bathroom where Lily had been playing dress-up with her dollhouse friends. When Evelyn found the unmarked bottle while cleaning, her first instinct was protective. Children and medication don't mix, and she had seen too many emergency room visits begin with curious hands and unlocked medicine cabinets. She secured the pills in her own room temporarily, planning to ask James about their origin when he returned from his latest business trip to Silicon Valley, where his company was negotiating a merger worth over $400 million. But Vivian discovered the missing bottle before Evelyn could explain, and panic transformed rational thought into desperate accusation. In her mind, clouded by withdrawal anxiety and the fear of exposure, the only explanation was theft. She confronted Evelyn in the marble-floored foyer, her voice echoing off the high ceilings as she accused the nanny of stealing medication, of violating the family's trust, of crossing boundaries that should never be crossed. The accusation landed like a physical blow. Evelyn, who had given her whole heart to this family, who had sacrificed her own comfort and dignity for their well-being, found herself branded a thief by the very woman whose secrets she had unknowingly been protecting. She tried to explain, her calm voice a stark contrast to Vivian's hysteria, but explanation requires an audience willing to listen, and Vivian was too consumed by her own fears to hear truth. When James's black Tesla pulled into the circular driveway that evening, he walked into a house divided by accusation and wounded pride. Vivian met him at the door with tears and trembling hands, painting herself as the victim of Evelyn's supposed betrayal. The pills were offered as evidence, their presence in Evelyn's room presented as proof of guilt rather than protection. James, exhausted from days of high-stakes negotiations and facing his wife's emotional breakdown, made the decision that would haunt him for months to come. He called Evelyn into his study, that wood-paneled sanctuary where million-dollar deals were negotiated and life-changing decisions were made. The room smelled of leather and expensive scotch, its walls lined with awards and photographs that documented his rise from middle-class ambition to extraordinary wealth. Behind his mahogany desk, surrounded by symbols of his success, he delivered the blow that would exile the woman who had been the heart of his home. "I'm sorry, Evelyn," he said, though his tone suggested obligation rather than genuine regret. "This relationship has become too complicated. I think it's best if you find other employment." The words hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle, acrid, lingering, and indicative of something precious that had just died. Evelyn stood perfectly still for a moment, her dignity intact even as her world crumbled around her. She didn't beg or plead or offer desperate explanations. She simply nodded once, a slight inclination of her head that acknowledged the finality of his decision while refusing to accept the shame he was trying to assign to her actions. "When would you like me to leave?" she asked, her voice steady despite the earthquake rattling through her chest. "Tonight would be best," James replied, already turning away to shuffle papers on his desk, as if her dismissal was just another business transaction requiring his signature. "Vivian is very upset, and I think a clean break would be healthiest for everyone." Everyone. The word echoed in Evelyn's mind as she climbed the servants' stairs to her small room one final time. Everyone, apparently, did not include Noah and Lily, who were sleeping peacefully in their beds, unaware that the person who loved them most in the world was about to vanish from their lives without explanation or goodbye. It didn't include her own broken heart, which had foolishly believed that years of devotion might earn her the benefit of the doubt when accusations flew. She packed quickly and quietly, her few possessions fitting easily into the same suitcase she had carried up these stairs 18 months ago when hope was still possible, and she had believed that love might be recognized and valued. Her hands trembled only once when she picked up the faded photograph she kept on her nightstand, a candid shot of herself with Lily and Noah at the Lincoln Park Zoo, all three of them laughing at the antics of a playful sea lion. The children had insisted she be in the picture, had dragged her into the frame with the unconscious authority of those who consider you family. She slipped the photograph into her coat pocket, a talisman of better days and genuine love. Then stood looking around the small room that had been her sanctuary. The walls held indentations where she had hung pictures of her mother and the few family members who still called on holidays. The windowsill still bore rings from her coffee cup, evidence of early mornings when she had watched the sunrise paint the city in shades of hope and possibility. This room had been her home, the first place she had felt truly safe since her own childhood ended too soon in poverty and loss. As she descended the main staircase for the last time, suitcase in hand and dignity wrapped around her like armor, she heard stirring from the children's wing. Lily's voice, calling her name in the darkness, confused and frightened by the sounds of departure. For a moment, Evelyn paused, her mother's heart pulling her toward that familiar cry for comfort. But James had made his position clear. She was no longer welcome, no longer trusted, no longer family. To go to Lily now would be to defy his explicit wishes and perhaps make things worse for everyone, including the children who needed stability more than they needed her love. So she kept walking, each step echoing through the marble foyer like a countdown to exile. Behind her, Lily's calls grew more insistent, then faded as sleep reclaimed the confused child. Evelyn pushed through the heavy oak doors and out into the Chicago night, where November wind cut through her coat and carried with it the scent of Lake Michigan and the sound of her own heart breaking. The taxi ride to her small apartment on the south side took her through neighborhoods that told the story of the city's economic divide. From the gleaming towers of the Gold Coast, where penthouses sold for millions and doormen nodded respectfully at residents whose net worth exceeded small nations' GDP, She traveled through downtown's business district, empty now except for cleaning crews preparing tomorrow's stages for more million-dollar deals, and into the working-class neighborhoods where she had always belonged. Her studio apartment, with its second-hand furniture and single window facing an alley, felt both familiar and strange after months in mansion luxury. She had kept the lease, paying rent from her nanny's salary with the practical wisdom of someone who had learned never to assume security or permanence. Now she sat on her narrow bed, still wearing her coat, holding the photograph of herself with Lily and Noah, while tears she had refused to shed in James's presence finally found their release. The next morning brought the brutal reality of unemployment and wounded pride. Evelyn sat at her small kitchen table, drinking coffee from a chipped mug and trying to construct a future from the wreckage of her dismissal. Finding another nanny position would be difficult without references from her most recent employer, and she couldn't bring herself to call James and beg for the recommendation that might restore her professional reputation. Her savings account, carefully built from her modest salary over 18 months of service, would cover rent and basic expenses for a few months, but not indefinitely. More painful than financial uncertainty was the emotional amputation of sudden separation from Lily and Noah. She found herself listening for their voices, cooking breakfast for 3 before remembering she was alone, waking at night with the panicked certainty that one of them needed her comfort. Her body had adapted to the rhythms of their lives so completely that their absence felt like a phantom limb, constantly present in its very absence, aching with memory and loss. Meanwhile, in the Gold Coast mansion, the children's confusion quickly transformed into grief and then rebellion. They refused to accept Vivian's vague explanations about Evelyn moving on to help other families, instinctively recognizing evasion and lies. Noah started having nightmares again, the kind that had plagued him during his parents' divorce, dreams of abandonment and loss that left him sobbing in darkness nobody else could penetrate. Lily regressed to behaviors she had outgrown months ago, sucking her thumb and carrying stuffed animals like shields against a world that had suddenly become unreliable again. The house itself seemed to mourn Evelyn's absence. Routines that had run smoothly under her gentle guidance fell apart into chaos and arguments. Morning battles over breakfast stretched into epic struggles when no one remembered that Noah hated orange juice or that Lily's toast had to be cut into triangles, never squares. Bedtime became a nightly ordeal without Evelyn's soothing voice and infinite patience for extra stories and glasses of water and whispered fears about monsters that might be hiding in closets or under beds. James hired a temporary nanny through an expensive agency that specialized in serving Chicago's wealthiest families. Mrs. Henderson was professionally qualified, impeccably referenced, and completely wrong for the Mansell household. She approached childcare like a military operation, with schedules to be maintained and behaviors to be corrected rather than little hearts to be nurtured and understood. She lasted 3 days before Noah's tantrum over her refusal to read his favorite bedtime story, the one Evelyn had read with different voices for all the characters, resulted in a resignation letter citing unmanageable children and unreasonable expectations. The second replacement lasted a week. The third made it almost 2 weeks before Lily's persistent questions about Evelyn's whereabouts wore down her professional composure. Each failure reminded James of what he had lost, though pride prevented him from admitting his mistake or considering the possibility that Evelyn's value had been far greater than her salary suggested. Winter settled over Chicago with unusual harshness that year, as if the city itself was reflecting the emotional climate inside the Mansell mansion. Snow fell heavily and often, blanketing the Gold Coast in pristine white that made every other color seem muted and lifeless. The mansion's heating system, controlled by smart thermostats that maintained perfect temperature throughout 37 rooms, couldn't warm the chill that had settled into its heart. James found himself working longer hours, staying at his downtown office until exhaustion forced him home to a house that no longer felt like sanctuary. His company's merger negotiations had reached a critical phase. With hundreds of millions of dollars hanging in the balance and his own net worth set to increase exponentially if the deal succeeded. But success felt hollow when he returned each evening to children who barely looked up from their dinner plates, who answered his questions with monosyllables and saved their real conversations for whispered conferences in each other's rooms. Vivian, meanwhile, was spiraling into deeper anxiety and depression, her medication dependency growing as her ability to cope with daily stress diminished. She had won the battle against Evelyn, but victory felt like defeat when faced with the children's obvious resentment and James's growing emotional distance. She tried to fill Evelyn's role, but her efforts felt performative and desperate, like an actor playing a part she had never understood. Her attempts at maternal affection were met with polite tolerance at best, active resistance at worst. The truth emerged on a gray February afternoon, as these truths often do, accidentally, quietly, without drama or fanfare. James had returned home early with a migraine that made his office's fluorescent lights unbearable, seeking the dim tranquility of his study where he could rest until the pain subsided. He was looking for aspirin in Vivian's purse, with her permission, when his fingers closed around a small plastic bottle that rattled with familiar sounds. The pills inside were the same ones that had cost Evelyn her job and destroyed his children's security. Same shape, same color, same pharmaceutical markings that he had examined closely during that terrible evening when accusations flew and decisions were made in haste and anger. But these pills were in Vivian's purse, hidden beneath credit cards and cash and the daily detritus of a woman trying to hold herself together through pharmaceutical intervention. James stared at the bottle for a long moment, his migraine forgotten in the face of a revelation that restructured everything he thought he knew about loyalty, truth, and justice. The pills he held were proof of Evelyn's innocence, evidence that the medication she had secured in her room had indeed been found and protected, not stolen and abused. She had tried to explain that night, he remembered now, but he had been too angry and too loyal to Vivian to listen to reason or consider alternative explanations. The guilt that crashed over him was worse than any physical pain he had ever experienced. He had destroyed an innocent woman's reputation and livelihood based on the desperate lies of someone he thought he could trust. He had torn his children away from the person who loved them most genuinely, who had cared for them with a devotion that his money could never purchase. He had chosen the wrong loyalty, believed the wrong story, and inflicted irreparable damage on the wrong person. When Vivian found him an hour later, still sitting in his study with the pill bottle in his hands and tears streaming down his face, she knew instantly that her carefully constructed deception had finally collapsed. There was no point in more lies, no energy left for elaborate explanations or desperate justifications. She confessed everything then, the anxiety that consumed her days, the medication that barely controlled her panic attacks, the growing dependency that made her hoard pills like a dragon protecting treasure. "I was afraid," she whispered, slumping into the leather chair across from his desk like a marionette with severed strings. "Afraid you would leave me if you knew how broken I am. Afraid the children would never love me if they saw how much I struggled just to get through each day. When I couldn't find the pills, I panicked. I convinced myself that Evelyn was the problem, that if she was gone, everything would be better." But nothing had been better. The house felt empty without Evelyn's warmth. The children were withdrawn and unhappy, and Vivian's own anxiety had only worsened under the guilt of her false accusations. She had gained nothing and lost everything, including her own self-respect and the possibility of genuine affection from the children who now avoided her whenever possible. James listened to her confession with a mixture of anger and pity, understanding for the first time the depth of her psychological struggles while simultaneously recognizing the magnitude of injustice he had inflicted on Evelyn. The woman who had given her heart to his family had been exiled based on lies, branded a thief by the very person whose secrets she had unknowingly protected. The enormity of his mistake felt like a weight pressing down on his chest, making it difficult to breathe normally. That evening, he attempted to explain the situation to Lily and Noah, choosing words carefully to protect their understanding while acknowledging the truth they had sensed all along, that Evelyn's departure had been based on misunderstanding rather than necessity. The children's reactions ranged from confusion to anger to desperate hope that their beloved Nanny might return to make their world right again. "Can we call her?" Lily asked, her 7-year-old logic cutting straight to the heart of the matter. "Can we tell her we're sorry and ask her to come home?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, exposing the full scope of damage that pride and hasty judgment had created. James realized he didn't even know where Evelyn was living, whether she had found other employment, or if she would be willing to forgive the family that had treated her so unjustly. The woman who had known every detail of his children's lives, their favorite foods, their bedtime rituals, their deepest fears and greatest joys, had become a stranger whose current circumstances were completely unknown to him. Finding Evelyn proved more difficult than James had anticipated. The employment agency that had originally placed her had no forwarding information beyond a phone number that was no longer in service. Her previous references, contacted through his assistant's research, knew nothing about her current situation. She had disappeared into the vast anonymity of Chicago's working-class neighborhoods, where people often lived paycheck to paycheck without leaving extensive paper trails of their movements. For weeks, James employed private investigators and search services, spending thousands of dollars to locate a woman who had once been as familiar as his own reflection. The irony wasn't lost on him. The same wealth that had enabled him to dismiss her so casually now funded desperate efforts to undo the damage his prejudice had created. His net worth continued to climb through successful investments and the completed merger that added $200 million to his company's valuation. But all the money in his cryptocurrency portfolios and stock holdings couldn't purchase what he had lost through his own failures of judgment and character. The breakthrough came through Noah's innocent persistence. The 10-year-old had been carrying Evelyn's photograph from the zoo visit in his backpack, showing it to teachers and classmates in the hope that someone might recognize her or know where she could be found. His 4th-grade teacher, Mrs. Patterson, had worked in Chicago public schools for 15 years and had connections throughout the city's educational and social service networks. "That woman looks familiar," she told Noah one afternoon, studying the photograph with the concentration of someone piecing together a puzzle. "I think she might volunteer at the community center on 47th Street. They serve meals to families and offer after-school programs. Let me make some phone calls." 2 days later, James received the call that would change everything. Evelyn was indeed volunteering at the Southside Community Center, using her skills and experience to help other working mothers navigate child care challenges and educational opportunities. She was there every Tuesday and Thursday evening and Saturday mornings, giving her time and expertise to families who couldn't afford the luxury of private nannies or exclusive preschools. The irony struck James with painful clarity. While he had been searching for her with expensive investigators and professional services, Evelyn had been exactly where she belonged, serving others, caring for children, and channeling her nurturing gifts toward those who needed them most. She hadn't retreated into bitterness or self-pity after her dismissal, hadn't wallowed in the injustice of her treatment. Instead, she had found another way to live out her calling, to be the maternal presence that children craved and deserved. On a Saturday morning in March, when winter finally began loosening its grip on Chicago and the first hints of spring painted the air with possibility, James drove his Tesla through neighborhoods he rarely visited, past corner stores and small churches, through streets where children played on stoops and elderly residents swept their front steps with the pride of people who owned little but cared deeply about what they had. The community center was housed in a converted warehouse, its brick walls painted with bright murals depicting diverse families and children at play. Inside, the smell of coffee and fresh bread mixed with the sounds of children's laughter and adult conversation in multiple languages. The main room had been set up for a community breakfast, with folding tables arranged in welcoming circles and volunteers moving between them, serving food and offering conversation to anyone who needed both nourishment and human connection. James stood in the doorway for several minutes, scanning the room for the woman he had wronged so deeply. He found her in the children's area, sitting cross-legged on the floor with a circle of youngsters ranging in age from toddlers to elementary schoolers. She was reading from a picture book, her voice animated as she brought the story to life with different voices and expressions. The children hung on her every word, their faces reflecting the same captivated attention that Lily and Noah had always shown during her bedtime stories. She looked different than he remembered. Thinner, perhaps, with new lines around her eyes that spoke of worry and hardship. Her clothes were simpler, clearly budget purchases rather than the modest but quality outfits she had worn while working for his family. But her smile was unchanged, warm, and genuine, reaching her eyes in the way that no amount of money could fake or purchase. She was still Evelyn, still the woman who could make any child feel precious and protected through the simple gift of her undivided attention. When the story ended and the children dispersed to other activities, James approached with steps heavy with shame and hope in equal measure. Evelyn looked up at his footsteps and recognized him instantly, though her expression remained carefully neutral, neither welcoming nor hostile. She rose gracefully from the floor, smoothing her modest skirt, and waited for him to speak first, a gesture of dignity that somehow made his guilt weigh even heavier on his conscience. "Hello, Evelyn," he said, his usual commanding presence reduced to uncertain humility. I've been looking for you. We need to talk." She nodded once. The same slight incline of her head she had given him on the night of her dismissal, and gestured toward a quieter corner where they could speak privately. They sat on plastic chairs designed for elementary school students, his expensive suit looking absurdly out of place in the community center's celebration of simple needs met through generous hearts. "I know the truth about the pills," he began, his voice barely above a whisper despite the noisy activity around them. "Vivian told me everything. I know you were innocent, that you were protecting Lily by securing that bottle. I know I made a terrible mistake, and I'm here to apologize and to beg for your forgiveness." Evelyn listened without interruption, her hands folded in her lap, her expression thoughtful but unreadable. When he finished his awkward confession and desperate request for absolution, she was quiet for a long moment, watching the children play across the room with the same gentle attention she had always given to his own son and daughter. "How are Lily and Noah?" she asked finally, cutting straight to what mattered most to her heart. "Are they well? Are they happy?" The question revealed everything about her character and priorities. Despite the injustice of her treatment, despite months of struggling to rebuild her life after his false accusations, her first concern was still for the children she had loved as her own. Not her own vindication, not his apology, not the acknowledgement she deserved, just the welfare of two little hearts she continued to carry in her own. "They miss you terribly," James admitted, his voice cracking with emotion he rarely allowed himself to display. "Nothing has been the same since you left. They ask about you constantly. The house feels empty without your warmth, without your love. We all feel your absence every single day." Tears gathered in Evelyn's eyes then, the first visible crack in the composed dignity she'd maintained throughout their conversation. But they were tears of joy rather than sorrow, relief that the children she had raised and loved still remembered her, still felt the bond that had formed through countless bedtime stories, scraped-knee comfort sessions, and whispered confidences shared in the darkness of childhood fears. "I never stopped loving them," she said simply. "I never stopped praying for their happiness and safety, not even after everything that happened." Her forgiveness, when it came, was as generous and unconditional as everything else about her character. She bore no grudges, harbored no bitterness, wasted no energy on resentment that would only poison her own heart. She had learned long ago that forgiveness was a gift she gave herself as much as others, freeing her spirit from the chains of past wrongs to embrace whatever possibilities the future might hold. But forgiveness didn't mean a simple return to the way things had been. Too much had changed. Too much trust had been broken and rebuilt for easy solutions. Evelyn had found purpose and community in her volunteer work, had discovered that her gifts were needed and appreciated in ways that extended far beyond any single wealthy family's private needs. She had also learned, through months of reflection and prayer, that her own worth couldn't depend on others' recognition or validation. "I can't come back as your employee," she told James gently but firmly. "Too much has happened for that kind of relationship to work again. But if you're willing, if the children want to see me, perhaps we could find a new way to be in each other's lives." The reunion with Lily and Noah took place the following weekend in Lincoln Park, on neutral ground where past injuries could be set aside in favor of present joy. The children's reaction to seeing Evelyn again validated everything their father had realized about her importance in their lives. They ran to her with the unconscious trust of the truly beloved, wrapping their arms around her waist and talking simultaneously in their eagerness to share everything she had missed during their separation. James watched from a distance as his children came alive again in Evelyn's presence, their faces bright with the happiness that had been missing from the mansion's echoing rooms. She listened to their stories with complete attention, exclaimed over their growth and achievements, and responded to their questions about her own life with honesty appropriate to their ages. She was still Evelyn, still the woman who could make any moment feel magical through the simple alchemy of genuine love and interest. The new relationship that developed over the following months was different from the traditional employer-employee dynamic that had defined their previous interaction. Evelyn remained independent, continuing her volunteer work and maintaining her own apartment, but she became a regular and welcomed presence in the children's lives. She joined them for weekend outings, attended their school events, and resumed the bedtime story tradition that had been such a cornerstone of their emotional security. James, humbled by his recognition of her true worth, established a foundation in Evelyn's name dedicated to supporting working mothers and child care providers throughout Chicago. The Evelyn Martinez Foundation, funded through a significant portion of his investment profits, including substantial cryptocurrency gains, provided scholarships for early childhood education, emergency assistance for families facing temporary hardship, and professional development opportunities for caregivers whose work was essential but often undervalued. At the Foundation's inaugural gala, held in one of Chicago's most prestigious hotels with an audience of the city's wealthiest philanthropists and social leaders, James introduced Evelyn not as a former employee, but as the inspiration for the Foundation's mission and a woman whose example had taught him the true meaning of service and love. She stood on the stage in a simple but elegant dress, far from the designer gowns worn by other attendees, and spoke about the dignity of care work and the importance of recognizing the emotional labor that holds families and communities together. The applause she received was long and heartfelt, coming from an audience that finally understood what James had learned too late the first time, that worth isn't measured in net assets or stock portfolios, but in the quiet consistency of love given without expectation of return. Several wealthy families approached her afterward, seeking to hire her services, but Evelyn politely declined. She had found her calling in community service and had no desire to return to the isolation and emotional complexity of private household employment. Vivian, meanwhile, had begun receiving professional treatment for her anxiety and depression, finally acknowledging that wealth couldn't cure mental health challenges that required genuine therapeutic intervention. Her relationship with the children gradually improved as she learned to be honest about her struggles and limitations rather than pretending to perfections she couldn't maintain. She would never replace Evelyn and Lily and Noah's hearts, but she could become something valuable in her own right, a flawed but trying adult who was learning to love them authentically. The mansion itself underwent subtle but significant changes under James's direction. The formal dining room where Evelyn had never been invited to sit was converted into a family room where everyone gathered for casual meals and homework supervision. The servants' quarters were renovated to reflect respect for the people who worked there, with comfortable furnishings and private spaces that acknowledged their dignity and humanity. Most significantly, James commissioned a portrait of Evelyn to hang in the main hallway alongside family photos, honoring her role in their lives with the visual recognition she had always deserved. On Thanksgiving Day, nearly 2 years after that terrible night when false accusations had torn their family apart, the Mansells gathered around their table with gratitude deeper than they had ever experienced. Evelyn was there as an honored guest rather than a servant, sharing the meal she had helped prepare and the conversations that flowed as naturally as breathing. The turkey may have been prepared by hired caterers, but the warmth filling the room came from hearts that had learned to recognize and cherish authentic love. Lily, now 9 and wise beyond her years, raised her glass of apple cider in a toast that silenced the table with its simple profundity. "I'm thankful for Evelyn," she said, her young voice clear and confident, "because she taught us that family isn't just the people you're born with. It's the people who love you enough to stay, even when staying is hard." The words hung in the air like a benediction, blessing a family that had been broken by prejudice and pride, but healed through humility and recognition of truth. James wiped away tears he no longer felt ashamed to shed, understanding finally that strength didn't require emotional isolation or the pretense of self-sufficiency that his wealth had made possible. Real strength lay in acknowledging need, recognizing gift, and honoring the people whose quiet service made abundant life possible. Noah, mature at 12 and already showing signs of the empathy that Evelyn's example had nurtured in his character, added his own toast. "And I'm thankful that love is stronger than mistakes, and that second chances can fix even the things we break the worst." Evelyn smiled through her own tears, her heart full to overflowing with the richness of belonging she had never dared hope for during those lonely months of exile. She had learned that love does indeed leave roots, that kindness plants seeds that bloom even in the darkest seasons, and that forgiveness has the power to transform not just relationships, but entire families' understanding of what it means to be truly wealthy. The evening concluded with Evelyn reading bedtime stories to children who were no longer small enough to sit on her lap, but who still craved the comfort of her voice, weaving dreams and possibilities in the darkness. Her own apartment on the south side remained her home, but the Mansell mansion had become something it had never been before, a place where love was measured not by bank account balances or stock market returns, but by the simple presence of people who chose to stay, to serve, and to see the sacred in the everyday moments that create a life worth living. As autumn deepened into winter and the city prepared for another season of snow and transformation, Evelyn continued her work at the community center, her volunteer service now supported by the resources of the foundation that bore her name. Children from all backgrounds and circumstances experienced her gift for making every young person feel precious and worthy of attention. She had become what she had always been destined to be, not just a nanny to the wealthy, but a mother figure to anyone who needed the steady presence of unconditional love. James, meanwhile, discovered that acknowledging his mistake and honoring Evelyn's worth had transformed not just his family relationships, but his entire approach to business and life. He began treating his employees with the same respect he had learned to show Evelyn, recognizing that every person who contributed to his company's success deserved dignity and appreciation regardless of their position in the corporate hierarchy. His net worth continued to grow through wise investments and successful ventures, but wealth had finally become a tool for service rather than a symbol of superiority. The foundation thrived, supporting hundreds of families and child care providers throughout Chicago and expanding to other cities where the need for recognition and support of care workers was equally urgent. Evelyn served on the board of directors, her practical wisdom and deep understanding of working mothers' challenges providing crucial guidance for programs and policies. She had found her voice as an advocate, speaking at conferences and community meetings about the dignity of care work and the importance of supporting the women whose labor makes everything else possible. On quiet evenings when her public responsibilities were set aside and she sat in her small apartment with a cup of tea and her mother's old Bible, Evelyn reflected on the strange turns that life had taken. The daughter she had given up for adoption 25 years earlier had never been far from her thoughts, but her love for Lily and Noah had taught her that motherhood extends far beyond biology. She had learned to trust that love multiplies rather than diminishes when shared generously, that the heart has infinite capacity for affection when it remains open to grace and possibility. The scars from her past, the poverty of her childhood, the loss of her daughter, the false accusations that had temporarily destroyed her reputation had not disappeared, but they had been transformed from sources of shame into wellsprings of empathy and understanding. Her own pain had taught her to recognize and comfort pain in others, making her more effective in her work with struggling families and more authentic in her relationships with everyone she encountered. The Mansell children grew and flourished under the combined influence of their father's increasing emotional availability and Evelyn's continued presence in their lives. Noah developed a strong sense of justice and a compassion for those less fortunate than himself, inspired by Evelyn's example of service and his father's recognition that wealth carried responsibility for others' welfare. He talked of becoming a teacher or social worker, choosing from among the careers that focused on helping rather than accumulating. Lily, artistic and sensitive, channeled her creativity into projects that celebrated the dignity and beauty of working people. Her school art projects featured portraits of janitors, cafeteria workers, and other support staff whose labor was essential but often invisible. At 10, she already understood that true nobility lay in service rather than status, a lesson that would shape her entire approach to life and relationships. Vivian found her own path to healing and contribution, using her experience with mental health challenges to support other women struggling with similar issues. She started a support group for wealthy wives and mothers dealing with depression and anxiety, creating a safe space where privilege couldn't hide pain and authentic healing could begin. Her relationship with Evelyn, initially poisoned by jealousy and fear, gradually transformed into mutual respect and even friendship based on their shared commitment to the children's welfare. The annual Foundation Gala became one of Chicago's most anticipated charitable events, not for its social prestige, but for its authentic celebration of people whose work was normally overlooked and undervalued. Evelyn continued to speak at these events, her presence on stage a living reminder that worth isn't determined by wealth or position, but by the love and service we offer to others. Her words, simple but profound, touched hearts that had been hardened by competition and materialism, inspiring new approaches to philanthropy and community engagement. Years passed with the gentle rhythm of seasons changing and children growing, of foundations flourishing and families healing. The photograph from the Lincoln Park Zoo, the one that had sustained Evelyn through her darkest months after her dismissal, was now framed and displayed in the Mansell hallway alongside other family memories. But it no longer represented a lost past. It had become the first chapter in an ongoing story of love that transcends traditional boundaries and definitions. On a spring morning 5 years after their initial reunion, Evelyn received an unexpected phone call from a social worker in Wisconsin. Her daughter, the child she had given up for adoption so many years earlier, had been searching for her birth mother and was ready to meet if Evelyn was willing. The young woman, now 28 and an elementary school teacher in Milwaukee, had grown up in a loving adoptive family, but had always wondered about the woman who had given her life, and then, through the most difficult decision possible, given her the chance for a better life than poverty could provide. The reunion, when it finally took place, was awkward but healing. Evelyn's daughter, Sarah, bore a striking resemblance to her birth mother, but had been shaped by experiences and opportunities that were vastly different from Evelyn's own childhood. She had graduated from college, traveled internationally, and built a career she loved, all made possible by the sacrifice her teenage mother had made in recognizing that love sometimes requires letting go. Sarah was curious about her birth mother's life, but harbored no resentment about the adoption decision. She understood, as an adult and an educator herself, the impossible circumstances that young mothers often faced and the courage required to choose a child's welfare over one's own desires for connection. Meeting Evelyn helped her understand her own calling to work with children and her instinctive nurturing abilities, traits that now clearly had genetic as well as environmental roots. The meeting also brought Evelyn full circle in her understanding of motherhood and sacrifice. She had spent years believing that giving up her daughter was her greatest failure, the wound that had driven her to love other people's children with desperate intensity. But seeing Sarah as a confident, caring adult helped her recognize that her decision had been an act of love rather than abandonment, a choice that had allowed her daughter to flourish in ways that keeping her might not have permitted. Sarah met Lily and Noah during her visit to Chicago, immediately recognizing the bond between them and her birth mother. The young teacher understood what these children meant to Evelyn and what Evelyn had meant to them during their formative years. She could see how her mother's capacity for love had been channeled into relationships that were chosen rather than biological, creating family bonds that were no less real for being unconventional. The visit concluded with promises to stay in touch and tentative plans for Sarah to spend Christmas in Chicago with Evelyn and the extended Mansell family. For Evelyn, the reunion represented the final healing of old wounds and the completion of a circle that had taken decades to close. She had learned that love doesn't require possession or control, that motherhood can be expressed in countless ways, and that the heart's capacity for affection is truly limitless when it remains open to grace and possibility. As spring blossomed into summer and Chicago came alive with the energy of warm weather and outdoor festivals, the foundation expanded its reach into new areas of service. A scholarship program for women seeking careers in childcare and early education was launched with great success, providing opportunities for people like Evelyn to gain formal training and credentials for work they were already doing with natural skill and deep commitment. The program's first graduating class included 12 women from diverse backgrounds who had been recognized for their exceptional ability to nurture and educate children. Each had received financial support for their studies and would continue to receive mentoring and professional development through the Foundation's network. At their graduation ceremony, held in the same community center where James had found Evelyn years earlier, each graduate was presented with a certificate signed by Evelyn herself, now recognized throughout the city as an expert in child development and family support services. Speaking to the graduates, Evelyn reflected on her own journey from dismissed employee to respected advocate and community leader. "Your work matters," she told them, her voice carrying the authority of experience hard-won through years of service and sacrifice. "The children you care for will remember your kindness long after they've forgotten their formal lessons. The families you support will be stronger because of your presence in their lives. Never let anyone convince you that caring for others is less important than any other work in the world." The applause that followed was led by James, who sat in the audience with his own children and several other wealthy families who had become supporters of the Foundation's mission. He had learned to see Evelyn not as the woman who had once worked in his household, but as a leader and advocate whose vision was transforming how Chicago approached support for working families and child care providers. One evening in late summer, as sunset painted the Chicago skyline in shades of gold and rose, Evelyn sat on a bench in Lincoln Park watching families enjoy the warm weather. Children played on swings and slides while their parents chatted nearby, creating the kind of casual community that she had always valued more than formal social gatherings. Her own life had found a rhythm that satisfied both her need for service and her desire for personal fulfillment. A young mother approached her bench, struggling with a fussy toddler and looking exhausted by the day's challenges. Without hesitation, Evelyn offered assistance, and soon had the little boy laughing at her silly faces while his mother caught her breath and regained her composure. It was a tiny moment, unremarkable to casual observers, but it encapsulated everything that made Evelyn's life meaningful. The willingness to see need and respond with immediate kindness, the ability to bring comfort to both children and adults through simple presence and attention. The mother thanked her profusely before gathering her son and heading home, but Evelyn felt that she was the one who had received a gift. These spontaneous encounters with families in need reminded her why her work mattered and renewed her energy for the larger advocacy efforts that now occupied much of her time. Every child she soothed, every parent she supported, was part of the same calling that had led her to the Mansell household years earlier, and had ultimately transformed them all. As autumn returned to Chicago and the foundation prepared for its 5th anniversary gala, Evelyn received word that she would be receiving the city's highest civilian honor for her contributions to child welfare and family support. The award ceremony would be held in the same hotel ballroom where she had first spoken publicly about the dignity of care work, bringing her journey full circle in the most meaningful way possible. The recognition, while gratifying, was less important to her than the knowledge that hundreds of families throughout the city were stronger and more stable because of programs she had helped design and implement. Children were receiving better care, mothers were gaining skills and credentials that improved their earning potential, and fathers were learning to be more involved in their children's daily lives. The ripple effects of the foundation's work were immeasurable but undeniably real. On the night of the award ceremony, Evelyn wore a dress that Sarah had helped her choose, elegant but not ostentatious, befitting someone whose greatest accomplishments had been measured in changed lives rather than accumulated wealth. James escorted her to the podium when her name was called, and the entire audience rose in recognition of her contributions to their community. In her acceptance speech, Evelyn reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment of recognition and honor. She spoke of the children who had taught her that love transcends biological relationships, the families who had trusted her with their most precious possessions, and the community that had embraced her vision for supporting working mothers and child care providers. But mostly, she spoke of gratitude, for second chances, for forgiveness received and given, and for the privilege of serving others in work that filled her heart even as it challenged her mind and spirit. 5 years ago, she concluded, her voice carrying clearly through the ballroom filled with Chicago's civic and business leaders, I thought my life was ending because I had lost a job I loved and children who meant everything to me. But I learned that love is never really lost. It just finds new ways to express itself. The foundation bearing my name has allowed me to love not just 2 precious children, but hundreds of families throughout our city. That multiplication of love, that expansion of family beyond traditional boundaries, is the greatest gift anyone could receive. The standing ovation that followed continued for several minutes, but Evelyn's attention was focused on the faces in the audience, Lily and Noah, now teenagers who still sought her counsel on important decisions, Sarah, her biological daughter who had become a cherished friend and confidant, James, whose journey from emotional distance to engaged fatherhood had been one of the most dramatic transformations she had ever witnessed, and Vivian, who had found her own path to mental health and meaningful contribution to their community. They, along with thousands of others whose lives had been touched by the Foundation's programs, were her true legacy. The award itself would eventually gather dust on a shelf, but the love she had shared and the love she had received would continue rippling outward through generations of families who had learned to value and support each other through her example and advocacy. Later that evening, after the formal ceremony had ended and the other guests had departed for their own homes, Evelyn found herself once again at the Lincoln Park Zoo with Lily, Noah, and James. They stood before the sea lion exhibit where that first photograph had been taken so many years earlier, watching the playful animals and remembering the journey that had brought them all to this moment of peace and reconciliation. "Do you ever regret it?" Lily asked, now 16 and preparing for college with plans to study social work. "Do you ever wish you had never come to work for us?" Evelyn considered the question seriously, as she always did when one of the children asked her something important. The pain of those early months after her dismissal was still accessible in her memory, as was the fear and uncertainty that had accompanied her search for new direction and purpose. But standing there with these young people who had become such an integral part of her heart, surrounded by the evidence of love that had survived betrayal and grown stronger through testing, she could only feel gratitude for the entire journey. "Never," she said firmly. "Even the hard parts, even the times when I thought I would never recover from the hurt, all of it led us to where we are now. And where we are now is exactly where I always dreamed of being, even when I didn't know such dreams were possible." Noah, now 18 and heading to college himself with plans to study education and work with disadvantaged youth, wrapped his arms around Evelyn in the spontaneous hug that had become his trademark expression of affection. "We're the lucky ones," he said. "We're the ones who got to have you as our family, even when some people didn't understand what family really means." James, watching his children with the woman who had shaped their characters and values more than any formal education ever could, felt the familiar surge of gratitude mixed with humility that had become his dominant emotional response whenever he contemplated Evelyn's presence in their lives. His net worth had continued to climb over the years, his investment portfolio now worth over $500 million, including substantial gains in cryptocurrency and technology stocks. But all that wealth paled in comparison to the richness of relationship and authentic love that Evelyn had brought into their family. As they walked back toward their cars under a canopy of stars barely visible through the city's ambient light, Evelyn reflected on the circular nature of her journey. She had begun as a young woman giving up her own child out of love and necessity, had spent years caring for other people's children while carrying the wound of that loss, had been falsely accused and dismissed from the job that had given her life meaning, and had ultimately found her way back to family and purpose through forgiveness and the recognition of her true worth. The little girl she had once been, growing up in poverty on Chicago's South Side, could never have imagined the life she now lived, not because it was filled with luxury or material comfort, but because it was filled with authentic love and meaningful service to others. She had learned that wealth could be measured in ways that had nothing to do with bank account balances or stock market performance, and that the richest people she knew were often those who gave generously of themselves without expecting recognition or reward. Her apartment, still modest by Gold Coast standards, but comfortable and filled with photographs and mementos from years of relationships and service, had become a gathering place for women from throughout the city who sought her counsel and support. Former nannies dealing with difficult employers, young mothers struggling to balance work and family responsibilities, teachers working in underfunded schools, all found their way to Evelyn's kitchen table where wisdom was shared freely over coffee and homemade bread. These informal mentoring sessions had grown into a formal program through the foundation, with Evelyn training other experienced caregivers and educators to provide support and guidance to women entering the field. The program, called Circles of Wisdom, met monthly in community centers throughout Chicago and had expanded to other cities where the need for such support networks was equally urgent. At each Circles of Wisdom gathering, participants shared both challenges and successes, learning from each other's experiences while building the kind of community that sustained them through the emotional demands of their work. Evelyn facilitated these discussions with the same gentle authority she had brought to bedtime stories and family crises, creating safe spaces where women could be vulnerable about their struggles while celebrating their achievements and contributions. The success of these programs had brought Evelyn to the attention of national organizations focused on child welfare and family support, leading to speaking engagements and consulting opportunities that expanded her influence far beyond Chicago. But she remained rooted in her local community, committed to the hands-on service that had always been the foundation of her calling. Her calendar was full, but never too full to respond when individual families needed immediate support, or when children required the kind of attention that only she seemed able to provide. One December evening, as Chicago prepared for its first major snowfall of the winter, and the Foundation's offices hummed with activity related to holiday programs for low-income families, Evelyn received a phone call that brought unexpected news. A former colleague from her early days in domestic service had been following her career transformation through media coverage of the Foundation's work and wanted to share a story that she thought Evelyn should hear. The caller, Maria Santos, had worked as a housekeeper for several wealthy Chicago families over the years and had always admired Evelyn's professionalism and kindness during the brief period when they had worked for the same employment agency. Maria's current employer, she explained, was a recently widowed businessman struggling to care for 3 young children while managing a complex financial empire that included substantial real estate holdings and international investments. The man, whose name was Robert Chen, had hired and dismissed 4 nannies in the past 6 months, finding each inadequate to meet his children's needs for emotional support and stability. His oldest daughter, age 8, was struggling in school and showing signs of selective mutism that had developed after her mother's death from cancer. The 2 younger children, twin boys age 5, were acting out behaviorally and had been expelled from their previous daycare for aggressive incidents. Maria believed that Evelyn's expertise and experience might be exactly what the Chen family needed, but she also knew that Evelyn no longer took private employment positions. Still, she felt compelled to pass along the information in case Evelyn might know someone else who could help or might be willing to consult on the situation from her current position with the Foundation. The request touched something deep in Evelyn's heart, reminding her of her own introduction to the Mansell household and the desperate needs of children who had lost their primary source of security and love. She found herself thinking about the Chen family throughout the night, wondering about children she had never met but who were clearly suffering from the kind of emotional wounds she had spent her career learning to heal. The next morning, she called Maria back to get more details about the family's situation. What she learned confirmed her instincts about the depth of their needs and the urgency of finding appropriate support for them. Mr. Chen, who had built his wealth through a series of successful technology startups and now managed investment portfolios worth hundreds of millions of dollars, was completely overwhelmed by the demands of single parenthood while maintaining his professional responsibilities. His late wife had been the children's primary caregiver, handling all aspects of their daily routines, emotional support, and educational oversight. Chen had been loving but distant, the kind of father who provided generously but left the intimate work of child-rearing to his spouse. Now, faced with grief-stricken children who needed more than he knew how to give, he was struggling to balance business obligations that couldn't be ignored with parenting responsibilities he had never learned to navigate. The story was achingly familiar to Evelyn, who recognized the pattern of wealthy men who confused financial providing with emotional nurturing. But she also heard echoes of James's journey and Chen's situation, the possibility for transformation and growth if the right kind of support and guidance could be provided at the right moment. After several days of reflection and prayer, Evelyn decided to reach out to Chen directly, not to offer her services as a nanny, but to suggest a consulting arrangement that might help him understand his children's needs, while also connecting him with appropriate long-term caregiving support. She had learned through her foundation work that sometimes the most effective intervention involved educating parents about child development and emotional needs, rather than simply providing substitute care. The meeting took place in Chen's downtown office, a sleek space on the 40th floor of a building that offered panoramic views of Lake Michigan and the Chicago skyline. Chen himself appeared younger than Evelyn had expected, probably in his late 30s, with the kind of intense focus that successful entrepreneurs often developed through years of high-pressure decision-making. but his eyes held the exhausted confusion of someone dealing with problems that money couldn't solve. Evelyn spent an hour listening to Chen describe his children's struggles and his own feelings of inadequacy as their sole remaining parent. She asked questions about their routines, their relationships with each other, and the ways they had processed their mother's death. What emerged was a picture of 3 children who needed not just professional childcare, but therapeutic support and patient rebuilding of their sense of security and family stability. Rather than recommending another nanny, Evelyn suggested a comprehensive approach that would involve child psychology services, temporary assistance with daily routines, while Chen learned to take on more of the intimate work of parenting and ongoing family counseling to help them all adjust to their new circumstances. She offered to help coordinate these services and provide periodic consultation as they worked through the process of healing and adjustment. Chen's relief at finding someone who understood the complexity of his situation was palpable. Previous nanny candidates had focused on their own qualifications and the children's immediate behavioral challenges, but none had looked at the deeper emotional needs that were driving those surface problems. Evelyn's approach acknowledged both his love for his children and his recognition that love alone wasn't sufficient to meet their current needs. Over the following months, Evelyn worked with the Chen family in a consulting capacity, helping Robert understand his children's grief responses while connecting them with appropriate therapeutic resources. She observed family interactions, provided guidance on establishing new routines that included more emotional intimacy, and helped Chen recognize the ways his own grief was affecting his ability to be present for his children's needs. The transformation was gradual but steady. Chen's daughter began speaking more freely as her sense of security was rebuilt through consistent, patient attention to her emotional needs. The twin boys' aggressive behavior diminished as they learned healthier ways to express their feelings about their mother's death and their fear of losing their father as well. Chen himself grew into a more emotionally available parent, learning to balance his professional responsibilities with the intimate work of raising children who had experienced profound loss. The work with the Chen family reinforced Evelyn's understanding that her greatest contributions came not from direct child care, but from helping families recognize and respond to children's deeper emotional needs. She began developing training materials for other consultation work, sharing the insights she had gained through decades of experience with families facing various types of crisis and transition. The Foundation's Board of Directors, recognizing the value of this approach, authorized the creation of a new program focused on family crisis intervention and consultation services. The program, called Healing Hearts, would provide short-term intensive support for families dealing with death, divorce, job loss, or other circumstances that threaten children's sense of security and stability. Evelyn was asked to direct the new program, a role that would allow her to work directly with families in crisis while also training other professionals to provide similar services. The position represented the culmination of her career transformation from private household employee to recognized expert in child welfare and family support services. As spring returned to Chicago and the Foundation celebrated another year of expanding services and growing impact, Evelyn found herself reflecting on the unexpected paths that life could take. The young woman who had given up her own child decades earlier could never have imagined that she would eventually become a leader in the field of child and family services, influencing policy and practice throughout the city and beyond. But perhaps the trajectory made perfect sense in retrospect. Every loss she had experienced, every challenge she had faced, every moment of growth and learning had prepared her for the work she was now doing. Her personal journey through sacrifice, service, dismissal, and redemption had given her both the practical skills and the emotional wisdom necessary to help other families navigate their own difficulties. The photograph from Lincoln Park Zoo, now displayed in her foundation office alongside awards and recognition from various community organizations, remained a powerful symbol the circularity of love and the ways relationships could transcend traditional boundaries and definitions. The children in that photograph had grown into young adults who sought her counsel on important life decisions and included her in their celebrations and milestones. The man who had once dismissed her as just the nanny had become a trusted friend and collaborator in work that honored the dignity of caregiving and family support. Sarah, her biological daughter, had become a regular visitor to Chicago and an enthusiastic supporter of the Foundation's work. Her perspective as both an adopted child and an educator provided valuable insights for programs designed to support children in transitional family situations. She had also brought her adoptive parents to meet Evelyn, creating an extended network of relationship and support that enriched everyone involved. The Mansell family members remained central figures in Evelyn's life, but they were no longer the exclusive focus of her emotional energy and care. Lily and Noah, now in college but still returning regularly to Chicago for holidays and summer breaks, were part of a larger family that included Sarah, the Chen children, and dozens of other young people who had been touched by Evelyn's work through the Foundation and its various programs. James, whose business empire had continued to grow and profit through wise investments and strategic acquisitions, had become one of Chicago's most respected philanthropists, largely through Evelyn's influence on his understanding of wealth and responsibility. His donations to various community organizations, totaling tens of millions of dollars from his cryptocurrency gains and traditional investment returns, were always made with input from Evelyn about which programs would have the greatest impact on children and families in need. Vivian had found her own calling in mental health advocacy, using her experience with anxiety and depression to support other wealthy women dealing with similar challenges. Her support group had grown into a nonprofit organization that provided therapy services and educational programs for people whose access to mental health care was complicated by concerns about privacy and social stigma. The work brought unexpected healing to Vivian's relationship with Evelyn, as both women recognized their shared commitment to breaking down the isolation that wealth and status could create around human vulnerability. Their friendship, built on mutual respect for each other's service to others, had become one of the more surprising outcomes of the family's journey through crisis and redemption. One evening in late summer, as Chicago prepared for another autumn season of changing leaves and school year beginnings, Evelyn sat in her office reviewing applications for the newest class of Circles of Wisdom participants. Each application told a story of a woman seeking support and guidance in the challenging but rewarding work of caring for other people's children, and each reminded her of her own younger self entering domestic service with more hope than experience. The work had come full circle in the most satisfying way possible. Instead of caring for individual children and individual families, she was now supporting the women who provided that care, ensuring that their expertise was recognized and their contributions valued. Instead of being invisible and underappreciated, she had become a voice for all the women whose quiet service made other people's success possible. A knock on her office door interrupted her review of the applications. Sarah entered, carrying coffee from their favorite cafe and the kind of smile that indicated good news to share. She had recently been promoted to principal at her elementary school in Milwaukee and had called to share the news and seek advice about the transition to administrative responsibilities. As they talked about Sarah's new role and the challenges of moving from teacher to principal, Evelyn felt the deep satisfaction of watching someone she loved grow into leadership and influence. Sarah's success was different from the business achievements that dominated headlines and influenced stock market valuations, but it was no less significant in its potential impact on children's lives and community well-being. Their conversation was interrupted by another visitor, Noah, now 21, and completing his senior year of college with a double major in education and social work. He'd come to discuss his plans for the year between graduation and graduate school, a year he wanted to spend working with the Foundation to gain practical experience in the field he intended to pursue. The request filled Evelyn with pride and hope, not just because Noah wanted to work with her organization, but because he had chosen a career path focused on service to others. The little boy who had once needed her comfort and guidance had grown into a young man committed to providing similar support to other children facing challenges and transitions. As they talked about Noah's goals and the ways the foundation might benefit from his energy and fresh perspective, Evelyn reflected on the multiplication of influence that seemed to define her life's work. Every child she had nurtured had grown up with a deeper understanding of compassion and service. Every family she had supported had become stronger and more capable of supporting others. Every woman she had mentored through the Circles of Wisdom program had gone on to provide better care for the children and families who depended on them. The ripple effects were immeasurable but undeniably real, spreading outward through generations in ways that no financial portfolio or business empire could ever achieve. This was the legacy she had built through decades of quiet service, not monuments or buildings with her name attached, but human hearts shaped by love and entire communities strengthened by the commitment to caring for each other's children as if they were their own. The office grew quiet as Sarah and Noah left for their own evening activities, leaving Evelyn alone with her thoughts and the stack of applications that still needed review. Outside her window, the Chicago skyline glittered with lights from thousands of homes where families were sharing dinner, helping with homework, and preparing children for sleep with bedtime stories and lullabies. In many of those homes, women were doing the work that Evelyn had done for decades, caring for children who weren't biologically their own, loving them as if they were family, providing the emotional security and nurturing attention that made everything else possible. Some were nannies and babysitters, others were teachers and daycare providers, still others were grandmothers and aunts stepping in where parents couldn't be present. All of them were part of the vast network of care that held communities together, and increasingly, thanks to the Foundation's advocacy and programming, their contributions were being recognized and supported. The work was far from complete. There were still families struggling to find quality child care, still women working for inadequate wages without benefits or professional recognition, still children whose emotional needs weren't being met because the adults around them didn't understand the importance of nurturing relationships. But progress was visible and measurable. The Foundation's scholarship programs had helped hundreds of women gain credentials and advance in their careers. The consulting services had strengthened dozens of families dealing with crisis and transition. The advocacy efforts had influenced city policies related to child care licensing, provider compensation, and family support services. Most importantly, the conversation about the value of care work had shifted throughout Chicago and beyond. Wealthy families were more likely to treat their household employees with respect and dignity. Community organizations were more aware of the needs of working mothers and single parents. Policymakers were more responsive to issues affecting children and families because they understood the economic and social importance of supporting the people who provided care. As Evelyn finally turned her attention back to the applications on her desk, she was struck by the diversity of women seeking to join the newest Circles of Wisdom cohort. They ranged in age from early 20s to late 50s, represented multiple racial and ethnic backgrounds, and brought experience from various sectors of the care economy. Some were experienced nannies seeking professional development. Others were new mothers hoping to turn their parenting skills into career opportunities. Still others were career changers drawn to child and family services after success in other fields. What united them all was the recognition that caring for other people's children required both natural aptitude and learned skills, and that they could benefit from the wisdom and support of women who had navigated similar paths. They understood, as Evelyn had learned decades earlier, that love alone wasn't sufficient, that effective caregiving required knowledge, patience, cultural competency, and the kind of emotional resilience that could only be developed through practice and mentoring. Reading through their personal statements and professional goals, Evelyn felt the familiar stirring of excitement that came with the beginning of each new program cycle. These women would spend the next year learning from each other and from experienced mentors like herself, building the skills and confidence necessary to provide excellent care while advocating for their own professional recognition and fair compensation. Some would go on to start their own childcare businesses or family service organizations. Others would pursue advanced education in child development, social work, or related fields. Still others would remain in direct service roles, but with enhanced skills and stronger professional networks that would sustain them through the challenges and celebrate with them through the victories. All of them would carry forward the understanding that care work was skilled professional labor worthy of respect and adequate compensation, and that the women who performed this work were essential contributors to community well-being rather than invisible servants whose contributions could be taken for granted. The next morning brought news that would add another layer to Evelyn's sense of professional fulfillment. The Illinois state legislature had passed a bill, supported by advocacy from the foundation and other organizations, that would provide state funding for professional development programs for child care providers and increase minimum wage requirements for domestic workers, including nannies and housekeepers. The legislation represented years of careful advocacy work, coalition building, and public education about the economic importance of the care economy. Evelyn had testified before legislative committees, participated in rallies and public demonstrations, and worked behind the scenes to build support among lawmakers who might not initially understand the issues affecting working mothers and child care providers. The bill's passage would directly benefit thousands of women throughout Illinois, while also setting a precedent that advocates in other states could build upon. More importantly, it represented a fundamental shift in how society valued and supported the work of caring for children, acknowledging that this work required skill, deserved professional recognition, and should be compensated fairly. Evelyn's phone began ringing early that morning with calls from reporters, other advocacy organizations, and foundation supporters who wanted to congratulate her on the legislative victory and discuss its implications for future policy work. But the call that meant the most came from Maria Santos, the colleague who had originally contacted her about the Chen family. Maria had been following the foundation's advocacy work and wanted to express her gratitude for the ways Evelyn's efforts were changing life for women like herself. The wage increase provisions of the new law would directly affect her income and financial security, while the professional development funding would allow her to pursue training that could lead to higher-paying positions with better working conditions. "You changed everything for us," Maria said, her voice thick with emotion. "Not just for me, but for my daughters and granddaughters who will grow up in a world that respects the work we do. You took all the pain of what happened to you and turned it into something beautiful for the rest of us." The conversation reminded Evelyn of the larger historical context of her work. She was part of a long tradition of women who had cared for other people's children, often at great personal sacrifice and with little recognition or reward. Many of these women were immigrants, women of color, or others who had limited options for economic advancement. Their labor had made it possible for more privileged women to pursue careers in education while ensuring that children received loving care. But the traditional power dynamics of this work had often left caregivers vulnerable to exploitation and abuse. They worked long hours for low wages, had little job security, and were expected to be grateful for the opportunity to serve more affluent families. Their own families often suffered because they were caring for other people's children, and their expertise and contributions were rarely acknowledged or valued. Evelyn's own experience of false accusation and dismissal was part of this larger pattern of treating domestic workers as disposable rather than valuable. But her journey from victim to advocate had created opportunities to challenge these patterns and work toward more equitable relationships between families and the people they employed to care for their children. The new state legislation was one concrete result of these efforts, but the cultural changes were equally important. Families were having different conversations about their relationships with nannies and housekeepers. Children were growing up with more awareness of the dignity and importance of care work. Young women considering careers in childcare and family services were seeing new possibilities for professional advancement and recognition. These shifts would take time to fully manifest, but they were already visible in the experiences of women participating in foundation programs and in the changing tenor of public discussions about work and family. The invisible labor that had sustained families and communities for generations was becoming more visible, and the women who performed this labor were finding their voices and asserting their rights to fair treatment and compensation. As autumn deepened into winter, and Chicago prepared for another season of snow and celebration, the Foundation's annual report documented another year of expanding impact and growing influence. The numbers were impressive. Hundreds of women served through various programs, dozens of families strengthened through crisis intervention services, millions of dollars in scholarships and emergency assistance distributed to those in need. But the statistics couldn't capture the human stories behind the numbers, the single mothers who had gained the credentials and confidence to start their own childcare businesses, the families who had healed from crisis and loss through patient therapeutic support, the children who were thriving because the adults around them had learned to recognize and respond to their emotional needs. Evelyn kept many of these stories in a special file, not for public relations purposes, but for her own inspiration during difficult days when progress seemed slow and obstacles seemed insurmountable. Letters from program participants describing new jobs and educational opportunities, photographs from families who had worked through crisis and found new stability, updates from former clients who had gone on to provide mentoring and support to other women in similar situations. Each story was a reminder that the work mattered, that individual lives were being changed in ways that would ripple forward through generations. Every woman who gained new skills and confidence would provide better care for the children in her charge. Every family that learned to value and support domestic workers would raise children with different attitudes about service and dignity. Every community that strengthened its support systems for working parents would be more resilient and compassionate. The approaching holiday season brought with it the familiar rhythm of increased need and increased generosity. The Foundation's emergency assistance program saw higher demand as families struggled with heating bills and holiday expenses, while donors responded with contributions that made it possible to meet those needs. Thanksgiving meal programs required coordination among dozens of volunteers, and Christmas gift programs for children in low-income families required months of planning and community partnership. Evelyn found herself working longer hours during these busy seasons, but the work felt more energizing than exhausting. This was the direct service that had always fed her soul, the hands-on helping that reminded her why she had entered care work in the first place. Seeing children's faces light up when they received gifts, watching families enjoy holiday meals they couldn't have afforded on their own, facilitating reunions between extended family members who had been separated by economic hardship, all of it reinforced her conviction that this work was sacred calling rather than mere employment. The Mansell family's own holiday traditions had evolved to include service projects coordinated through the Foundation. James, Lily, and Noah spent Christmas morning volunteering at community breakfast programs before gathering for their own family celebration. Vivian organized donation drives among her social circle, channeling the competitive energy of Chicago's elite women toward charitable purposes. Sarah traveled from Milwaukee to participate in these activities, bringing her adoptive parents who had become enthusiastic supporters of the Foundation's work. These holiday gatherings were multi-generational affairs that included not just the immediate Mansell family, but also other families who had been touched by the Foundation's programs. Children who had received scholarships or emergency assistance played alongside the Mansell children, creating friendships that crossed economic and social boundaries. Parents who had found strength through crisis intervention services shared meals with the volunteers who had supported them through difficult transitions. The celebrations were reminders of Evelyn's expanded understanding of family and community. The traditional nuclear family model that had once defined her professional goals had given way to a more inclusive vision of kinship based on mutual care and support rather than blood relationships or legal arrangements. She had learned to create family wherever love and commitment were present, whether that was in the mansion on the Gold Coast or the community center on the South Side. But perhaps the most meaningful tradition was the annual reading of holiday stories to children at various community sites throughout the city. Evelyn visited homeless shelters, transitional housing programs, and after-school programs during December, carrying her worn collection of favorite books and the gift of unhurried attention to children who often received very little of either. These reading sessions drew on all the skills she had developed as a nanny, the ability to modulate her voice to bring characters to life, the patience to answer questions and encourage participation, the intuition to recognize when a child needed extra comfort or attention. But they also connected her to the broader community of children who needed the same love and security she had provided to Lily and Noah during their younger years. Watching these children respond to her stories and attention, seeing their faces brighten with engagement and curiosity, she was reminded that her calling had never really been about serving one specific family. It had always been about recognizing and responding to children's universal needs for love, security, and the kind of patient adult presence that made them feel valued and protected. The work had come full circle, but with a much broader scope and deeper impact than she could ever have imagined when she first climbed the steps of the Mansell mansion with her single suitcase and hopeful heart. She was still caring for children, still providing the emotional nurturing that made everything else possible, but now her care extended to entire communities, and her influence shaped policies and practices that affected thousands of families. As the year drew to a close and Chicago settled into the deep quiet of winter snow, Evelyn found herself thinking about the upcoming spring and the new initiatives the foundation would launch with the additional state funding that was now available. There were plans for expanded scholarship programs, new research projects on best practices in family crisis intervention, and pilot programs that would test innovative approaches to supporting working parents and child care providers. The work would continue to evolve and grow, but its essential character would remain the same, recognizing the dignity of care work, supporting the women who performed this essential labor, and ensuring that children received the love and attention necessary for healthy development. These had been her core values since entering domestic service decades earlier, and they would continue to guide her efforts regardless of how her title or role might change. Sitting in her small apartment on a snowy evening, surrounded by photographs and mementos from years of service and relationship, Evelyn felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived and meaningful work well done. She had learned that love was indeed the strongest force in human experience, that forgiveness had the power to transform even the most damaged relationships, and that service to others was the path to genuine fulfillment and lasting legacy. The young woman who had given up her own child in poverty and desperation could never have imagined the journey that had brought her to this moment of peace and purpose. But every step along the way had been necessary. Every loss had contributed to her capacity for compassion, and every challenge had strengthened her ability to help others navigate their own difficulties. Tomorrow would bring new opportunities to serve, new families to support, new ways to advocate for the recognition and dignity that all caring people deserved. But tonight, in the quiet sanctuary of her own home, she could rest in the knowledge that her life had made a difference, that her love had indeed left roots that would continue growing long after her own season of active service had ended. And you, have you ever cared for someone who later forgot you? Tell me your story in the comments. If this story touched your heart, leave a like and subscribe so this message reaches another woman who deserves to feel seen. To continue this emotional journey, we've prepared a special podcast with more moving stories. You can find it by clicking on the left. Thank you for walking this path of the heart with us. We'll meet again in our next story.